The city never slept, but Caleb Thorne owned its silence from the top floor of his towering glass building. He often stood alone at night, staring down at the glowing veins of traffic weaving through the streets like restless rivers. The city pulsed beneath him, loud, chaotic, and alive. But up there, everything felt still, controlled, and predictable, just like his life. Caleb adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit. The fabric felt smooth and expensive against his skin. Everything about him reflected precision. His posture, his movements, even his breathing. A man built by discipline, sharpened by ambition, and crowned by success. At his peak, he was already a legend. His name carried weight in boardrooms across continents. From bustling financial hubs to distant capitals, people spoke of Caleb Thorne with a mixture of admiration and envy. He had built an empire from almost nothing: real estate developments, strategic investments, and a fast-growing tech venture that analysts claimed would soon rival global giants. But those who watched from the outside only saw the surface. They didn't see the nights he slept in his car. They didn't see the hunger. They didn't see the promise he made to himself as a young boy in a forgotten village. I will never be small again. And he wasn't. Not anymore. The boardroom buzzed with energy. Men and women sat around the long, polished table, their faces lit by soft golden light and the glow of presentation screens. Charts, projections, and numbers all pointed in one direction. "We're looking at a projected 40% increase," one of the analysts said, adjusting his glasses nervously. "If the expansion goes as planned, we could double our valuation." Murmurs of approval filled the room. Caleb sat at the head of the table, fingers steepled, eyes calm but sharp. He didn't smile easily, but when he did, it meant something. "Good," he said simply. Beside him sat Nathaniel Crow. Nathaniel wasn't just a business partner. He was history. They had met years earlier when Caleb was still climbing, still fighting his way into rooms that didn't want him. Nathaniel had been one of the few who believed in him early. Or at least, that's what Caleb thought. Nathaniel leaned slightly toward him, lowering his voice. "We're close now. This deal changes everything." Caleb nodded. "It already has." What neither of them said out loud was the truth. They were standing at the peak, and peaks are dangerous places. The first crack came quietly. So quietly, Caleb almost missed it. It started with a delayed transfer, then a missing document, then a call from a major bank. "Mr. Thorne," the voice on the phone said, overly polite. "We're having trouble verifying some recent transactions linked to your corporate accounts." Caleb frowned. "That's not possible. Everything is cleared through proper channels." "I understand, sir, but the amounts, they're significant." "How significant?" A pause. "Hundreds of millions." Silence filled the room. Caleb's grip tightened around the phone. "That's a mistake," he said coldly. But deep down, something didn't feel right. By the following period, the storm had begun. His legal team rushed into his office, their faces tense. "Sir, we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "They're accusing the company of financial misconduct, money laundering, fraudulent transfers." "That's ridiculous." "I know," the lawyer said quickly, "but the evidence, it's detailed." Caleb stood up slowly. "Show me." Files were spread across his desk. Transaction logs, offshore accounts, signatures, approvals, all tied to him. Perfectly constructed. Too perfectly. "This is fabricated," Caleb said, his voice steady, but low. "All of it." The lawyer hesitated. "Sir, the authorizations carry your digital signature." Caleb froze. That was impossible, unless his mind snapped to one person. Nathaniel. Caleb didn't wait. He stormed into Nathaniel's office without knocking. Nathaniel looked up, calm as ever. "Caleb, what did you do?" Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, studying him. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Don't play games with me." Caleb slammed the documents onto the desk. "These transactions, this setup, it leads back to you." Nathaniel glanced at the papers, then back at him. And then he smiled. Not the friendly smile Caleb knew, but something colder, something final. "You were always brilliant," Nathaniel said softly. "But you had one weakness." Caleb's chest tightened. "You trusted too easily." The words hit like a blow. "What did you do?" Caleb repeated, this time quieter. Nathaniel stood. "I took an opportunity. You destroyed everything." "No," Nathaniel said calmly. "I transferred everything." Caleb's heart pounded. "Where?" Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Somewhere you'll never reach again." The fallout was immediate, brutal, and relentless. Banks froze his accounts. Investors pulled out. Partners distanced themselves overnight. News headlines exploded across every platform. Billionaire Caleb Thorne under investigation. Financial scandal rocks global business empire. From success to suspect. The fall of a giant. His phone never stopped ringing, but not with support. With accusations, questions, doubt. The same people who once praised him now dissected him publicly and ruthlessly. The empire collapsed piece by piece. Properties were seized. Companies shut down. His name became poison. And through it all, Nathaniel vanished, gone without a trace, with everything. Caleb stood in his now empty penthouse one last time. The furniture had been taken. The art removed. The silence was different now. Not peaceful, but hollow. He walked slowly across the marble floor, his footsteps echoing. This was where he had celebrated victories, closed deals, built dreams. Now it was just space. Cold and unforgiving. He stopped by the window. The same view, the same city, but everything had changed. For the first time in years, Caleb Thorne had nothing. That night, he packed a single bag. No designer suits, no watches, no symbols of wealth. Just a few clothes and memories he couldn't leave behind. At the door, he paused, not because he wanted to stay, but because he understood something now. Everything he had built could be taken in an instant. The journey back to the village was long, longer than he remembered. Or maybe it just felt that way. The road grew rougher, the buildings disappeared, the noise faded, and with every mile, Caleb shed another layer of the man he used to be. By the time he arrived, he was unrecognizable, not just to others, but to himself. The village stood exactly as he had left it years ago. Dusty roads, mud houses, children running barefoot, life untouched by the world he had conquered. He stepped down from the bus slowly. People stared at first with curiosity, then recognition, and finally, something else. Whispers began. "Is that him? It can't be the billionaire." What happened? Caleb kept walking, head high, but heart heavy. Every step felt like judgment, every glance like a reminder. He had left this place as a promise. He returned as a failure. His father's house stood at the edge of the village, or what was left of it. The roof sagged. The walls were cracked. Time had not been kind. He pushed the door open. It creaked in protest. Dust filled the air. The smell of abandonment lingered. Caleb stepped inside, and for a moment just stood there alone. No empire, no allies, no safety net. Just him and the ruins of where he began. He dropped his bag, sat on the floor, and finally allowed himself to feel it. Not anger, not pride, but loss. Deep, heavy, unavoidable. The kind that doesn't shout, but settles quietly in your chest. For the first time in years, Caleb Thorne closed his eyes. Not as a billionaire, not as a businessman, but as a man who had fallen completely. Outside, the village continued its life, unbothered, unchanged, unaware that a giant had just collapsed among them. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the broken house, one truth settled in the silence. This was not just the end of his empire. It was the beginning of something else, something harder, something humbling, something that would test not his wealth, but his soul. And in that quiet, forgotten village, the former billionaire took his first step into a life he never imagined. A life where survival would replace success, and where the man he truly was would finally be revealed. The morning sun rose slowly over the village, stretching golden light across the dusty paths, the mud walls, and the quiet roofs that had seen generations come and go. But inside his father's house, there was no warmth, only discomfort, only reality. Caleb woke up on the bare floor. For a moment he didn't move. His body ached, not from physical labor but from unfamiliarity. The hardness beneath him pressed into his bones, reminding him that the soft luxury he once knew was no longer his world. He opened his eyes slowly. The ceiling above him was cracked with a faint line running across it like a scar that refused to heal. A cobweb clung stubbornly to one corner. He stared at it, not because it was interesting, but because he had nowhere else to look. Then it hit him again. This is real. This is your life now. He exhaled slowly and sat up, rubbing his face. His hands felt rougher already, as though the village itself had begun reshaping him overnight. The silence inside the house was heavy. No staff, no distant hum of comfort. Just the faint sound of goats bleating somewhere outside, and voices, whispers. He stepped outside, and the whispers grew louder. People had gathered, not in a crowd, but in clusters. Women by the roadside paused mid-motion. Young men leaned against a broken fence, pretending not to stare. Children pointed without shame. The news had spread. The fallen billionaire was back. Caleb stood still for a moment, letting the morning air fill his lungs. It smelled of earth, firewood, and life stripped down to its simplest form. Then he began to walk. Each step felt like walking through judgment. An older man called out, his voice carrying across the open space. It was Chief Harlan, a man who had once praised him when he sent resources back to the village. Now his tone was different, curious, measured. "So you have returned," the chief said, approaching slowly with his walking stick. Caleb nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir." The chief studied him carefully, eyes scanning his worn clothes, his empty hands, his lack of presence. "No convoy? No guards?" A few people nearby chuckled softly. Caleb kept his face neutral. "No, sir." The chief nodded slowly, as though confirming a suspicion. He leaned closer. "Life is unpredictable." Then he turned and walked away. Just like that. No welcome, no sympathy, just observation. As Caleb continued down the path, the murmurs followed him like a shadow he couldn't shake. "I heard he lost everything." They said he stole money. No, his partner betrayed him. Either way, look at him now. A group of young men laughed loudly as he passed. One of them, Trey, someone Caleb vaguely remembered as a boy, stepped forward with a smirk. "Ah, big man," Trey called out mockingly. "Where is your private jet?" The others burst into laughter. Caleb stopped. For a split second, the old version of him rose to the surface, but just as quickly, it faded. He looked at Trey calmly. "Good morning." The simplicity of the response caught them off guard. Trey scoffed. "Morning? That's all?" Caleb didn't respond. He walked on, and somehow that hurt more than any insult. Hunger arrived, not as a suggestion, but as a demand. Caleb hadn't eaten since the previous period. Back in the city, food had always been available. Now, there was nothing. He checked the small kitchen area of the house. Empty. No supplies, just old rusted pots and a broken wooden shelf. He stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. This was a new kind of problem, one money used to solve instantly. Now money was gone, and pride was expensive. He stepped outside again, this time with a purpose. He needed food. But how? The answer was obvious, as the thought alone made his chest tighten. Caleb Thorne asking for help. The irony was almost unbearable. Still, hunger doesn't negotiate. He approached a nearby compound, where a woman was cooking over an open fire. The smell of boiling yam and pepper soup drifted into the air, rich and inviting. His stomach tightened. The woman looked up as his shadow fell across the ground. She froze. Recognition flickered across her face. "Caleb," she said slowly. He nodded. "Yes, Ma." There was a pause. Then she wiped her hands on her wrapper. "You need something?" The question was simple, but the answer felt heavy. Caleb hesitated, then forced the words out. "I was wondering if you might have something I could eat." Silence. The woman looked at him. Really looked at him. Not the billionaire. Not the success story. Just a man. Hungry. Her expression softened. "Sit," she said gently. Relief washed over him. Quiet, but powerful. "Thank you," he said. He sat on a small wooden stool as she served him a modest portion of food. Pepper soup. Nothing extravagant, but to him it was everything. He ate slowly at first, then faster, then with a desperation he didn't want to admit. The woman watched him. "You've changed," she said softly. Caleb paused. "I had to." She nodded. "Life teaches." He gave a small, humorless smile. "Yes, it does." But kindness in the village was not quiet. By evening, everyone knew the billionaire was begging for food, the great Caleb eating from people's kitchens. Laughter followed the story like wildfire, and this time it reached deeper. As the sun began to set, Caleb sat outside his father's house, watching the sky shift from gold to orange to deep blue. Children ran past him, still laughing. A group of women whispered loudly nearby, not bothering to hide their words. He couldn't survive in the city. Now he will learn. Pride goes before a fall. Each sentence landed like a stone, but Caleb didn't move, didn't respond, didn't defend himself, because deep down he knew something they didn't. They were right about one thing. He had fallen. Night came quickly. Darkness swallowed the village, broken only by lanterns and small fires. Inside the house, Caleb sat on the floor again. But this time, something was different. The pain was still there, the humiliation, the loss. But beneath it, a quiet realization began to form. He had survived worse, not as a billionaire, but as a boy who had once lived in this same village, who had known hunger, who had known struggle, who had dreamed his way out. And if he had done it once, could he do it again? He looked at his hands. They were not soft anymore, not protected, but they were still strong, still capable, still his. Slowly he stood up, walked to the corner of the room, and there, leaning against the wall, covered in dust, was his father's old hunting gun. Rusty, worn but intact. Caleb picked it up. It felt unfamiliar, heavy, real. Not like contracts or signatures. This was survival. He stared at it for a long moment, then nodded to himself. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "everything changes." Outside, the village slept, unaware that the man they mocked was beginning to adapt, to harden, to transform. Because humiliation can break a man, or can rebuild him stronger, sharper, unstoppable. And as Caleb lay down that night, hunger no longer the loudest voice in his body, a new thought replaced it. Not of what he had lost, but of what he could become. The billionaire was gone, but the man was just beginning. The first sound Caleb heard that morning was not birds. It was hunger, sharp, persistent, unforgiving. It dragged him out of sleep like a hand pulling him from water. His stomach twisted painfully, reminding him that yesterday's meal, his only meal, was already gone. For a moment he lay still on the cold floor, staring into the dim light creeping through the cracks in the wall. Then his eyes shifted to the corner, to the gun. His father's old hunting rifle rested there like a silent challenge. Caleb sat up slowly. There was no debate in his mind anymore, no pride left to negotiate with, no illusion of rescue. If he wanted to eat, he had to earn it. The village was still waking when he stepped outside. A faint mist clung to the ground, and the early morning air carried a coolness that would soon disappear under the harsh sun. Women swept their compounds. Roosters crowed. A few men prepared for the farms. And then there was him, walking in the opposite direction toward the forest. The same young men who had mocked him the previous day noticed immediately. Trey nudged his friend and burst into laughter. "Look, the billionaire is going hunting." More laughter followed. "With that old thing? He will shoot himself." Caleb didn't stop, didn't react. But this time, something inside him had changed. The words didn't pierce the same way. They landed and slid off. The path to the forest was narrow, winding through tall grasses and scattered trees. As Caleb walked, memories flickered at the edge of his mind. Distant, faded images of a younger version of himself trailing behind his father. He had been here before, but not like this. Not alone, not desperate. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. The village sounds faded, replaced by something else. Nature, alive, watching, waiting. Caleb paused at the edge of the thick forest. He adjusted his grip on the gun. His palms were slightly sweaty, not from fear, but from unfamiliarity. He exhaled slowly, then stepped in. Inside, the world changed. The air grew heavier, filled with the scent of damp earth and leaves. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above in broken patterns, creating shifting shadows that moved with the wind. Every sound mattered. Every movement meant something. A rustle, a snap, a distant call. Caleb's senses sharpened instinctively, but his mind was still catching up. Hours passed. Nothing. He walked, listened, waited. Still nothing. No animals, no opportunity, just silence and the growing ache in his legs. At one point, he heard a sudden movement in the bushes. His heart jumped. He raised the gun quickly, too quickly. The barrel shook slightly as he aimed. The bush moved again. His breath quickened. Now he pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing. No shot. Just a hollow, useless sound. Caleb froze, then slowly lowered the gun. His jaw tightened. He checked it. Empty. Of course, he hadn't even checked if it was loaded. Frustration surged. He ran a hand through his hair and let out a low breath. This wasn't business. There were no second chances built into contracts, no assistance, no safety nets. Out here, mistakes had consequences, immediate ones. By midday, the sun had grown merciless. Sweat soaked his shirt, clinging to his skin. His throat felt dry, his steps heavier. Still no success, still nothing to show. At one point, he stumbled slightly on a root. Catching himself just in time, he stopped, closed his eyes, and for a brief moment the old life flashed before him. Air-conditioned rooms, cold water on demand, comfort, ease, power. He opened his eyes again. Gone. All of it. Focus, he muttered to himself. You didn't come here to fail. He forced himself to slow down, to think, to observe. Not like a businessman, but like something else, something closer to the land. He remembered his father's voice faintly. The forest speaks, but only if you listen. Caleb stood still, completely still, and this time he listened. The wind shifted, leaves rustled gently, a bird called out, and then a faint sound. Soft, careful, deliberate movement. His eyes sharpened. There, between the trees, something moved again. Not random, not wind. Alive. Caleb crouched slowly, trying to steady his breathing. He adjusted the gun. This time, he checked it. Loaded. Good. The shape became clearer. Small. Not a deer. Too quick. A rabbit. His pulse quickened. This was his chance. He raised the gun again, but this time he moved slower, more controlled. He aligned the barrel carefully, his breathing steadied. The rabbit paused just for a second. That was all he needed. Caleb pulled the trigger. Bang! The sound exploded through the forest, echoing violently. Birds scattered. Silence followed. Caleb stood frozen, heart pounding, ears ringing. Then he looked ahead. The rabbit was gone. He missed. The weight of it hit instantly. All that effort, all that focus, gone in a second. Caleb lowered the gun slowly. Frustration surged again, stronger this time. He clenched his jaw hard. For a moment, anger threatened to take over, but he swallowed it, forced it down, because anger wouldn't feed him. The sun began to dip slightly. Time was running out. He had two choices: go back empty-handed, or keep trying. Caleb tightened his grip on the gun. I didn't come this far to return with nothing, he said under his breath. He moved deeper into the forest, further than he had gone before. The air grew thicker, the trees denser, but something inside him pushed forward. Not pride, not ego. Survival. And then he saw it. A deer. It stood near a clearing, grazing quietly, larger than anything he had expected. Strong, alert, beautiful. Caleb's heart slammed against his chest. This wasn't a rabbit. This was everything. Food, proof, dignity. But it also meant risk. One wrong move, and it would be gone. He crouched low, moving slowly behind a tree. Every step careful, every breath controlled. He raised the gun again. This time his hands were steadier. Not perfect, but better. The deer lifted its head slightly, alert, listening. Caleb froze completely. Even his breath slowed to almost nothing. Seconds stretched, heavy, endless. Then the deer relaxed, lowered its head again. Caleb adjusted his aim, focused, locked in. This moment was everything. He remembered the hunger, the laughter, the humiliation, the empty house, the fall, and then he pulled the trigger. Bang! The forest erupted again. Echoes bounced through the trees. Birds scattered wildly. Caleb stood still, heart racing, waiting. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. The deer lay on the ground, still and silent. He had done it. For a moment, he just stood there, staring, not moving, not celebrating, just absorbing it. Then something unexpected happened. Not joy, not pride, but something deeper, respect. He walked closer, kneeling beside the animal. His chest rose and fell slowly. "This is life now," he whispered. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. With effort, he lifted the deer onto his shoulders. The weight was heavy, far heavier than anything he had carried in years. But he didn't complain, didn't stop. Step by step, he began the walk back. By the time he reached the edge of the village, golden light stretched across the land, and then they saw him. First silence, then shock. The billionaire. He caught that? No, it can't be. Caleb walked through the village slowly, the deer across his shoulders, his shirt soaked, his face calm. No words, no announcement, no explanation. Just proof. Trey and his friends stood frozen. This time they didn't laugh. Caleb passed them without a glance. And for the first time since his return, the whispers changed. Not mockery, but something else. Respect. That night, as he sat outside his house preparing his hard-earned meal, he looked at his hands again. They were no longer the hands of a billionaire. They were the hands of a survivor. And somewhere deep inside him, a new identity began to take shape. Not Caleb the fallen, not Caleb the billionaire, but something stronger. Caleb the hunter. The village had always known royalty, not as a distant idea, but as a living presence. The palace stood on elevated ground at the far end of the village, its high walls painted in earth tones that blended with tradition and authority. It was not built like the glass towers of the city. There was no steel, no artificial shine, but it carried something far more powerful. History, power, control. And at its center lived King Harlan Voss, the ruler of the land, a man whose word carried the weight of law and legacy. For years the palace had been quiet, not empty, but missing something. The princess, Princess Celine, had left the village years ago, sent abroad to study, to grow, to become more than tradition expected of her. And now, she was returning. The entire village buzzed with anticipation. Women decorated the pathways leading to the palace with fresh leaves and colorful patterns. Drummers rehearsed under the shade of large trees, their rhythms echoing with excitement. Children ran back and forth carrying messages, gossip, and exaggerated stories. She studied abroad. They say she speaks with a worldly grace now. I heard she is more beautiful than before. Laughter filled the air. Even the elders seemed lighter. The return of the princess was not just an event. It was a moment. The convoy arrived. 3 black vehicles rolled slowly into the village, raising dust as they moved. The vehicles looked almost foreign against the natural setting, sleek, polished, out of place. The crowd gathered instantly. Drums began to beat. Voices rose. The doors opened. And then she stepped out. Princess Celine. She moved with quiet grace. Her presence commanded attention without demanding it. She wore a simple but elegant dress, nothing overly extravagant. Yet everything about it spoke of class. Her skin glowed under the sunlight, her posture straight, her eyes calm and observant. But it wasn't just her beauty. It was her composure, her awareness. She didn't rush, didn't wave dramatically. She simply stood for a moment, taking in the sight before her. The village, home. A faint smile touched her lips, not out of obligation, but recognition. As the drummers intensified their rhythm, she began walking toward the palace gates. Women ululated in excitement. Children danced around her. Elders nodded in approval. But Celine's eyes moved beyond the celebration. She noticed things others didn't. The cracks in certain houses, the tired faces hidden behind smiles, the subtle changes that time had carved into the village. Her time abroad had taught her many things, but one of the most important was how to see. That evening, the palace was alive. Celebration filled every corner. Music, food, laughter. Guests from nearby villages arrived to honor the king and welcome the princess back. Inside the grand hall, chandeliers cast warm light over polished floors. Servants moved gracefully between guests, offering trays of food and drink. Celine sat beside her father, listening as people spoke, praising, congratulating, admiring. But her mind wandered. "Celine!" Her father's voice pulled her back. She turned slightly. "Yes, father." "You seem distant." She smiled faintly. "Just observing." King Harlan studied her. "You have changed." "I have learned." He nodded slowly. "That is good." But there was something else in his gaze. Expectation. Responsibility. The unspoken weight of royalty. Later that night, when the celebration quieted and the palace settled into calm, Celine stood alone on her balcony. The village stretched before her under the moonlight, peaceful, still, but alive in its own quiet way. She inhaled deeply. The air was different, less filtered, more real. Then something caught her attention. Movement. At the far edge of the village path, a figure emerged from the darkness. A man walking slowly, carrying something heavy on his shoulders. Celine leaned slightly forward, curious. As he stepped into the faint glow of torchlight, she saw it. A deer, large, freshly hunted. Her brows drew together slightly. A hunter at this hour. But it wasn't the deer that held her attention. It was the man. His clothes were simple, worn. His body carried the strain of labor, but his posture was different. Even under the weight, he walked with a kind of quiet control. Not arrogance, not pride, but something else. Something steady. Something familiar. "Who is that?" she murmured softly to herself. The next morning, Celine requested to walk through the village. Her guards followed at a respectful distance, but she made it clear she wanted no disturbance. "I want to see," she said, "not be seen." As she walked through the village paths, people greeted her with bows and smiles. "Princess, welcome back. We missed you." She responded warmly, her presence gentle but dignified. But her eyes searched, not for admiration, for answers. Then she heard it. Two women talking near a well. "He came back with nothing. Used to be a big man in the city. Now he hunts like a common villager." Celine slowed her steps, interested. "Who are you talking about?" she asked. The women startled slightly, quickly bowing. "Princess, we didn't know you were—" "It's all right," Celine said calmly. "Who were you speaking of?" The women exchanged glances. Then one of them spoke. "Caleb." The name meant nothing to her. "Who is he?" The second woman stepped in. "They say he was once a billionaire, very rich, powerful." Celine's brows lifted slightly. "Was?" The woman nodded. "He lost everything, came back here, with nothing." The first woman added quickly, almost with a hint of satisfaction. "Now he hunts in the forest." Celine's gaze shifted slightly, thoughtful. A man who had everything, and now has nothing, she murmured. Her interest was no longer casual, it was awakened. Later that afternoon, as she sat in the palace courtyard, the image of the man from the night before lingered in her mind. The way he walked, the way he carried himself, it didn't align with the story. Most people change when they fall, she said softly to herself, but he didn't look broken. That thought stayed with her. The next day, she positioned herself near the outer section of the palace grounds, not waiting, just present, observing. And then he appeared. Caleb walking down the same path. Another deer across his shoulders, his movement steady, his expression calm. Celine watched him closely, every detail, the tension in his muscles, the focus in his eyes, the silence around him. People watched him too, but differently. Not with mockery this time, with something else. Curiosity, caution, respect, slowly forming. As he passed the palace gates, he didn't look up, didn't seek attention, didn't acknowledge the world watching him. He simply walked. Celine felt something shift inside her. Not attraction. Not yet. But something stronger than curiosity. Interest. A man who falls and still walks like he owns himself, she said quietly. For the first time since returning, Princess Celine felt drawn to something real. Not titles, not wealth, not expectations, but a man. A man the village had reduced to nothing, but who somehow still carried something they couldn't take away. And as she watched him disappear down the path, a quiet decision formed in her mind. I want to know his story, because deep down she already knew one thing. This was not just a hunter. This was a man with a past, a man with a fall, and perhaps a man with a future. And without realizing it, the princess had just taken her first step toward him. The morning air carried a different weight that day, not heavier, not lighter, just expectant. Caleb didn't notice it at first. To him, the day began like every other since he had taken up the life of a hunter. Early, quiet, purposeful. He woke before sunrise, his body already adjusting to the rhythm of survival. The aches in his muscles were no longer foreign. They had become part of him, like a constant reminder of the life he now lived. He sat up slowly, rolling his shoulders, his gaze drifting toward the corner. The gun, his father's gun. It no longer looked like an object of desperation. It looked like a tool. Outside, the village stirred awake, but this time the whispers had changed. Not completely, not kindly, but noticeably. That's him, the one that brought down a deer. They said he went deep into the forest. I heard he didn't even miss this time. Caleb stepped out of the house, the morning light catching his face. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge, but he heard everything. And strangely, it no longer weighed on him the same way. He walked toward the forest again. Same path, same silence, but a different man. This time, he didn't rush, didn't chase movement blindly. He observed, paused, listened. The forest greeted him differently too, not as an outsider, but not yet as one of its own. Hours passed, and once again he succeeded. By midday, Caleb emerged from the forest carrying another deer, not as heavy as the first, but enough. Enough to eat, enough to sell, enough to survive. As he approached the village, people noticed immediately. This time there was no laughter, only quiet attention. Even Trey, who had once mocked him openly, stood still, arms crossed, watching with narrowed eyes. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it. Caleb walked past them all, steady and silent until the voice was calm, soft, but commanding. Caleb paused, turned. Standing a few steps away was Princess Selene. For a brief moment, time seemed to stretch, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough. She stood in simple elegance, her posture straight, her gaze steady. No guards beside her, no crowd around her, just her and him. Caleb's eyes held hers for a second. Then he looked away slightly, respectfully. "You called me?" he asked. His voice was even, controlled. Selene studied him closely before responding. "Yes." Her eyes flicked briefly to the deer on his shoulders. "You hunt well." Caleb shifted the weight slightly. "It feeds me." The answer was simple, but something in it caught her attention. No pride, no need to impress, just truth. "I would like to buy it," she said. Caleb nodded once. "It is for sale." Silence followed. Not awkward, but filled with observation. Selene stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough. "You don't sound like a hunter," she said. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained calm. "What does a hunter sound like?" he asked. Her lips curved faintly. "Not like you." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he adjusted the deer again, then looked at her properly this time. "And what do I sound like?" Selene held his gaze. "Like a man who has lived differently." There it was. Not accusation, not judgment, but awareness. Caleb exhaled slowly. "You asked for the deer," he said. "Not my story." For the first time she smiled. It wasn't mocking. It wasn't playful. It was intrigued. "Fair," she said. She signaled to one of the palace attendants who had remained at a distance. The man stepped forward quickly, holding a small pouch. Selene took it and handed it to Caleb. He hesitated just for a second, then accepted it. "Thank you," he said, but Selene didn't move, didn't leave. Instead, she asked, "What is your name?" Caleb paused, a small pause, but noticeable. "Caleb," he said. Her brows lifted slightly. "Just Caleb?" He nodded. She studied him again, longer this time. "You've been here before," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Then why do they speak of you like a stranger?" Caleb's grip on the deer tightened slightly. "Because I am one now," he replied. Silence fell between them, but this time it carried weight. Selene's gaze softened slightly, not with pity, but with understanding. "You lost something," she said quietly. Caleb let out a small breath. "Everyone loses something. That is not what I meant." He looked at her again, this time more directly. "No," he said. "It isn't." Another pause. The world around them seemed to fade slightly. The distant chatter, the movement of people, the quiet rustling of leaves. It was just a conversation, but it didn't feel small. Selene tilted her head slightly. "You don't like being questioned." "I don't like unnecessary questions." "And this is unnecessary?" Caleb held her gaze. "Yes." For a moment it could have ended there. Sharp, dismissive, final. But Selene didn't react the way most would. She didn't take offense, didn't assert authority. Instead, she nodded. "Then I will ask something necessary." Caleb said nothing. She stepped back slightly, giving him space. "Will you come again tomorrow?" she asked. The question caught him off guard, not visibly, but internally. "For what?" "To sell," she said simply. Then, after a brief pause, "And to talk, if you choose to." Caleb studied her carefully. She wasn't forcing, wasn't demanding, just offering. "I hunt every day," he said. "That was not my question." Silence. Something in her tone. It wasn't royal. It wasn't commanding. It was human. Caleb adjusted the deer once more, then gave a small nod. "If I have something to sell," he said, "I will come." Celine accepted that. "Good," she said softly. She turned to leave, then paused. "And Caleb," he looked at her, "you don't walk like a man who has nothing." She held his gaze for a brief moment longer. "Remember that." Then she walked away, leaving him standing there, still quiet, changed. That evening, as Caleb sat outside his house, the pouch of money beside him, and the remains of his work before him, his mind wasn't on survival. Not entirely. It was on her. Her words, her questions, her presence. "You don't walk like a man who has nothing." He let out a slow breath. For the first time since his fall, someone had seen him. Not his failure, not his loss. Him. And that unsettled him more than anything else, because respect from strangers was one thing, mockery another. But being understood, that was dangerous. He leaned back slightly, staring up at the darkening sky. "Tomorrow," he murmured. But this time it wasn't about hunting. It was about something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Connection. And far away within the palace walls, Princess Celine sat by her window, looking out at the same sky, thinking of the man with quiet strength. The man who refused to explain himself. The man who carried loss, but did not bend under it. She smiled faintly. "This will be interesting," she whispered, because deep down she knew one thing already. This was not just a meeting. It was a beginning. And neither of them knew just how much that one encounter would change everything. The next morning came with a quiet anticipation. Neither of them spoke about it, but both of them felt it. Caleb woke before dawn again. That part of his life had become routine now. No alarms, no schedules, just instinct. His body had adjusted to the demands of survival, to the discipline of waking early, moving early, thinking ahead. But this morning something was different. He sat on the edge of the floor, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the hunting gun in the corner. Normally, his thoughts would be simple. Hunt, return. But today, another thought pressed in. She will be there. He exhaled slowly. It annoyed him slightly. Not her, but the fact that his mind had made space for something beyond survival. "This changes nothing," he muttered. Still, he stood up, prepared, and stepped outside. The village was beginning to wake again, but the energy around him had shifted further. People didn't laugh anymore. They watched, they observed, and some nodded. Trey stood with his usual group, but this time he didn't call out. He simply looked at Caleb as he passed. There was something in his eyes now, not respect yet, but no longer mockery. Caleb walked on toward the forest. The hunt that day was sharper, more focused, but also quicker. He moved through the trees with more confidence now, reading signs better, adjusting his steps, listening more than reacting. By mid-morning, he had his catch, another deer. He stood over it for a moment, catching his breath. But unlike previous days, his mind didn't linger on the success. It moved ahead to the palace. He lifted the deer onto his shoulders and began the walk back. The village path felt shorter that day, or maybe he just walked faster. By the time he reached the palace gates, she was already there. Princess Celine standing near the outer courtyard, as though she had simply decided to be there. But the timing was too precise to be coincidence. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition. Expectation. "You came," she said. Caleb adjusted the deer slightly. "I said I would." A faint smile touched her lips. "You said if you had something to sell." "I did." She glanced at the deer, then back at him. I see. This time there was no tension, no sharp edges, just ease. She motioned for the attendant again, and the exchange was made. But unlike the previous day, neither of them rushed to leave. Instead, Celine turned slightly and began walking along the palace's outer garden path. Then, without looking back, she said, "Walk with me." It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Caleb hesitated for a fraction of a second, then followed. They walked side by side, a comfortable distance between them. The garden was quiet, filled with trimmed shrubs, tall trees, and the faint scent of flowers carried by the breeze. For a while, neither of them spoke, and strangely, it wasn't awkward. Celine was the first to break the silence. "You learn fast." Caleb glanced at her briefly. "About what?" "The forest, the hunting, the way you move now. It's different." He looked ahead again. "Necessity teaches faster than comfort." She nodded. "That is true." A few steps passed. "My time abroad is the opposite," she added. That caught his attention. "How?" She smiled slightly, as if remembering something distant. "Everything is structured, predictable. You don't have to think about survival, just success." Caleb let out a small breath. "I know that life. I assumed you might." There was no sarcasm in her tone, just quiet acknowledgement. "Do you miss it?" she asked. The question hung in the air. Caleb didn't answer immediately. They continued walking, footsteps soft against the ground. Finally, he spoke. "I miss the control," he said. Celine turned slightly toward him. "Control?" He nodded. "In that world you plan. You decide. You move things. And here," he glanced around briefly, "here, you react." She considered that. "And which do you prefer?" He gave a small, almost amused exhale. "I don't think preference matters anymore." She studied him. "You speak like someone who has accepted something." "I have." "What?" He stopped walking. Celine stopped too. Caleb looked at her directly. "That life doesn't ask what you prefer." Silence. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight. Celine felt it. "You've changed," she said softly. He didn't deny it. "I had to." They stood there for a moment facing each other. Then Celine spoke again. "I think you were always like this." Caleb frowned slightly. "No," he said. "I wasn't." She shook her head gently. "You were. You just didn't need it before." That made him pause. Not because he agreed, but because he couldn't completely disagree. They resumed walking, this time closer, not intentionally, just naturally. "Tell me something," Celine said. Caleb glanced at her. "Something necessary?" She smiled. "Yes." He waited. "What made you leave the village the first time?" The question was simple, but the answer was not. Caleb's expression shifted slightly, not closed, but more guarded. "I wanted more." "More than what?" He looked ahead. "More than what this place could offer." She nodded slowly. "And you found it?" "Yes." "And then lost it?" "Yes." There was no shame in his voice, no bitterness, just fact. Celine observed him closely. "Does that make you regret leaving?" Caleb shook his head. "No." "Why not?" He stopped again. This time he looked at her with something deeper in his gaze. "Because I wouldn't be who I am now if I hadn't." That answer stayed with her. For a moment she said nothing. Then softly, "I think that's what I like about you." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Caleb blinked slightly. "What?" She hesitated just briefly, then held her ground. "You don't pretend." Silence. The air between them shifted again, but this time it was warmer. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You don't either," he said. She smiled faintly. "I try not to." A light breeze passed through the garden, rustling the leaves softly. For the first time they weren't just talking. They were connecting. Not as a hunter and a princess, not as a fallen man and a royal figure, but as two people who saw something real in each other. As they reached the end of the path, Celine slowed her steps. "Will you come again tomorrow?" she asked. Caleb didn't hesitate this time. "Yes." Her smile widened slightly. "Good." He turned to leave, but before he could take more than a step, "Caleb." He stopped, turned back. Celine's expression was softer now, less curious, more certain. "You're not what they say you are." He held her gaze. "And what do they say I am?" She tilted her head slightly. "A man who lost everything." Pause. Then she stepped a little closer. "I think you're a man who is becoming something." The words landed quietly, but deeply. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because for the first time he felt it too. Not just survival, not just rebuilding, but transformation. And as he walked away from the palace that day, he realized something he hadn't expected. He was no longer just looking forward to the hunt. He was looking forward to her. And back at the palace, Celine stood still for a moment, watching him go. Her heart was calm, but her thoughts were not. "This is not just curiosity anymore," she whispered, because deep down, she knew this was the beginning of something stronger, something dangerous, something undeniable. And neither of them were ready for how far it would go. The village had changed, not in structure, not in rhythm, but in attention. People were watching more closely now, watching Caleb, watching the palace, watching something they didn't yet fully understand. At first, it had been curiosity, a princess buying meat from a hunter. Strange, but harmless. Then it became routine. The hunter came. The princess was there. They spoke. They walked. They lingered. Now it was something else. "They talked too much," one woman whispered at the well. "I saw them yesterday." Another replied, "Walking like equals. That is not right. She is a princess, and he," the first scoffed, "a man with nothing." The word spread, slow, persistent like smoke, but neither Caleb nor Celine paid attention. Not yet, because what they were building was still theirs. That evening, the sky was painted in soft shades of gold and fading orange as the sun dipped low behind the trees. Caleb sat outside his house, sharpening a small knife with steady, practiced movements. The sound of metal against stone was rhythmic, calming, grounding, but his mind was elsewhere, on her. He paused just for a second, then shook his head slightly as if trying to push the thought away. "This is not wise," he muttered under his breath. But even as he said it, he knew it was too late for wisdom. A soft crunch of footsteps on dry earth broke his thoughts. Caleb looked up, and there she was, Celine. Not in royal attire, not surrounded by guards, just her. Simple, unannounced, standing a few steps away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb exhaled quietly. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Celine tilted her head slightly. "Why?" He stood up slowly. "Because people will talk." She smiled faintly. "They already do." That made him pause. She stepped closer. "I didn't come here for them," she said softly. Silence stretched between them. The air felt different, heavier, more personal. Caleb looked at her carefully. "You came alone?" "Yeah." "No guards, I didn't want any." He frowned slightly. "That's not safe." Her lips curved just a little. "I think I'm safe here." Something in her tone. It wasn't naive. It wasn't careless. It was trust. And that unsettled him more than anything. "You don't know that," he said quietly. "I do," she replied. Another silence. Then she looked around his home. The cracked walls, the worn ground, the simplicity. "This is where you live now," she said. "Yes," she nodded slowly. Then, without asking, she moved toward the small stool nearby and sat. Caleb watched her. "A princess sitting here," he said. She looked up at him. "Does it bother you?" He hesitated. He admitted. She smiled. Good. For a while they talked, not about titles, not about expectations, but about everything else, about the village, about her time abroad, about silence, about noise. Celine spoke of the fast pace, the endless movement, the way people lived without ever really seeing each other. "In a room full of people," she said, "you can still feel alone." Caleb leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "I know that feeling." She looked at him. "I thought you might." He gave a small nod. "And here?" she asked. "Do you feel alone?" Caleb thought about it, really thought, then shook his head slightly. "No." "Why?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because here I see everything." She smiled softly, and now he met her gaze. "Now I see someone." The words settled between them. Neither rushed to respond, because both understood what he meant. The sun had almost disappeared now, leaving behind a soft twilight that wrapped the village in calm. Celine stood slowly. "I should go," she said. Caleb nodded. "Yes." But neither of them moved immediately. Instead, they stood there, close, closer than before. The air shifted. Something unspoken began to rise. Celine looked at him, not as a princess, not as someone observing, but as a woman. "You're always so controlled," she said softly. Caleb exhaled slightly. "It helps with everything." She stepped a little closer. "And what happens when you stop controlling?" His gaze held hers. "I don't." A faint smile touched her lip. "Everyone does, eventually." Silence, the kind that pulls people closer. And then, without fully thinking, without planning, Celine reached out. Her fingers brushed lightly against his hand. Just a touch, but it was enough. Caleb stilled, not pulling away, not moving forward, just feeling it. The warmth, the reality. Something inside him shifted. The control he held so tightly flickered. Slowly he turned his hands slightly, their fingers intertwined. And in that moment, the world disappeared. No village, no expectations, no past. Just them. Celine's breath softened. "This is not wise," she whispered. Caleb gave a faint, almost ironic smile. "I said that earlier." She looked at him here. "Do you still believe it?" He didn't answer because his actions already had. He stepped closer, and then he kissed her. Soft, careful, real, not rushed, not overwhelming, but undeniable. Celine's eyes closed gently as she leaned into it, her hand tightening slightly in his. For a moment, time stopped. Everything they had been holding back, everything they hadn't said, found its way into that one, quiet, powerful moment. When they finally pulled apart, neither spoke, because there were no words for it. Only understanding, only truth. But reality always returns. In the distance, voices echoed faintly, guards searching. Celine stepped back slightly. "I have to go," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "Yes." But this time, there was something different in his eyes. Not hesitation, but certainty. She turned to leave, then paused. "Caleb." He looked at her. "This changes everything." He held her gaze. "I know." A small smile touched her lips. "Good." Then she walked away, leaving him standing there, but not the same man. The next morning, the village buzzed louder than before. They were seen together at night, alone. "This is too much," the whispers had grown. The curiosity had turned into judgment, and far away inside the palace, the king heard. As Caleb walked toward the forest that morning, he felt it. The stares, the tension, the shift. But this time, he didn't lower his head. He didn't hide, because something had changed. Not outside, but inside. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He wasn't just rebuilding. He had found something. Something worth standing for. Something worth risking. And as he stepped into the forest once more, one truth settled firmly in his chest. This was no longer just his fight. It was theirs. And love, once it begins, does not ask for permission. It simply grows. The palace had always been a place of order. Every movement measured, every voice controlled, every decision deliberate. But that morning, there was tension in the air, the kind that didn't need words to be understood. Servants moved more quietly than usual, their footsteps softer against the polished floors. Guards stood straighter, their expressions tighter. Even the birds that nested near the palace courtyard seemed to sense something had shifted, because within the walls of power, news had arrived. Not rumor, not speculation, but confirmation. Princess Selene had been seen outside the palace at night with the hunter. King Harlan sat in his private chamber, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. But his mind was anything but still. "Say it again," he said slowly. The guard standing before him swallowed lightly. "Your Majesty, the princess was seen near the lower village path late last night." The king's fingers tapped once against the arm of his chair. "And," the guard hesitated, then continued, "she was not alone." Silence. "With who?" the king asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. "The hunter." "Caleb." The name lingered in the air like an insult. The king leaned back slightly, slowly, deliberately. "A hunter," he repeated. Not loudly, not angrily, but with a kind of disbelief that carried more weight than shouting ever could. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king waved his hand. "Leave." The guard bowed quickly and exited, and then the silence returned. But this time it wasn't calm. It was brewing. Selene knew before she was summoned. She felt it in the way the palace moved, the way people avoided her eyes, the way her maid spoke less than usual. And when the message came, "His Majesty wishes to see you," she didn't hesitate. She stood, adjusted her dress, and walked toward the king's chamber with steady steps. No fear, only resolve. The doors opened. King Harlan sat waiting. Selene stepped in. "Father," she said respectfully. "Sit." She didn't. "I prefer to stand." The king's eyes narrowed slightly. "Sit." This time she obeyed, but her posture remained straight, unyielding. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the king leaned forward slightly. "Where were you last night?" Direct, cold. Selene met his gaze. "Outside." "With who?" Silence. "Answer me," the king said, his voice firm. "With Caleb." There it was. Truth unfiltered. The king's jaw tightened. "You admit it so easily. I see no reason to lie." A dangerous statement. The air in the room shifted instantly. "You have been seen with him before." "Yes." "You have spoken with him." "Yes." "You have visited him." Selene didn't respond immediately. Then, "Yes." The king stood abruptly. The movement echoed through the room like a crack of thunder. "Do you understand what you are doing?" he demanded. Selene remained seated. "Yes." "Then explain it to me," he said sharply. "Explain how a princess of this kingdom finds herself keeping company with a man who has nothing. Celine's gaze didn't waver. He is not nothing. The king's expression hardened. He is a fallen man, he said. A man without status, without standing, without value in this kingdom. Celine shook her head slowly. You see his position, she said. I see the man. The words landed heavily. The king took a step closer. You are blinded. No, she replied calmly. I am choosing. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. You will not see him again, the king said finally. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Celine stood. No. The word was quiet but absolute. The king's eyes flashed. What did you say? I said no. You defy me? He asked, disbelief laced with anger. I disagree with you, she corrected. The distinction didn't help. You will end this, the king said, his voice rising slightly. Immediately. I will not. The room seemed to shrink. You are a princess, he thundered. You do not choose your path based on emotion. Celine stepped forward. I am also a person, and your duty— My duty does not erase my humanity, she cut in. That stopped him. Not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. With conviction, with clarity, with strength. The king studied her long and hard. You think this is love? He asked, quieter now. Celine held his gaze. I know it is something real, and that is enough. Pause. Then the king turned away slightly, as though gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice was colder. Guards will be placed on you. Celine didn't react. You will not leave the palace without permission. Still no reaction. You will not see him again. This time she spoke. You can place guards around me, she said. You can restrict my movement. Then she took another step forward. But you cannot control what I feel. Silence. The king turned back slowly. This is not a game, Celine. I know. Then act like it. Their eyes locked, father and daughter, king and princess, authority and defiance. You will regret this, the king said finally. Celine's voice softened. Maybe, she said. Then, after a brief pause, but I would regret it more if I walked away from something true. She turned and walked out. The palace doors closed behind her. But the weight of that conversation followed. Guards were placed immediately, just as the king had said. 2 at her door, 2 at the courtyard. Eyes everywhere. But Celine didn't protest, didn't argue, because she knew something her father didn't. Restrictions do not stop determination. Meanwhile, in the village, Caleb felt it before he heard it. The shift. The stares were sharper now, less curious, more judgmental. And then Trey spoke. They say the king knows. Caleb stopped walking slowly. What does that change? He asked. Trey shrugged. For you, everything. Caleb continued walking, but this time his thoughts were heavier. He reached the edge of the forest, stopped, looked back toward the palace, and for the first time doubt crept in. Not about her, but about what this would cost. That night, as the village slept and the palace stood guarded, a shadow moved quietly along the back walls. Careful, precise. Celine. She slipped past the guards, not easily, but successfully. And as she stepped into the open path beyond the palace, she didn't hesitate. She walked toward him. When Caleb saw her standing there again, he didn't look surprised, but he didn't look calm either. You shouldn't be here, he said. She smiled faintly. You said that before. This is different. I know. Silence. Then she stepped closer. They've forbidden it, she said. I know, and I came anyway. Caleb looked at her carefully. Why? Her answer was immediate. Because I choose you. The words hit harder than anything else, stronger than defiance, stronger than rebellion, because they were simple and true. Caleb exhaled slowly. "This won't be easy," he said. "I'm not looking for easy." He studied her. "And if it costs you everything," she held his gaze, "then it will be worth everything." Silence. Then slowly he stepped closer, close enough to feel her breath, close enough to understand the weight of what she was saying. "This is real," he said quietly. "I know, and it changes everything. I know." Pause. Then he nodded. "Then we face it together." And as they stood there under the quiet night sky, one truth became undeniable. This was no longer curiosity, no longer coincidence, no longer something small. This was love, and love does not bow easily, even to kings. And the storm that followed was only just beginning. The village woke that morning under a strange silence, not the peaceful kind, not the quiet of dawn, but the kind that carries tension beneath it, like something unseen had shifted during the night. Caleb felt it the moment he stepped outside. The air itself seemed heavier. The usual morning sounds were there, roosters crowing, women sweeping, distant chatter. But underneath it all, there was awareness. Eyes on him more than before. He walked a few steps down the path, the hunting gun resting against his shoulder, when he noticed something unusual. People weren't just watching, they were stepping aside. Not out of respect, not entirely, but out of something else. Caution. Trey approached him slowly, hands tucked into his sides. Caleb stopped. "What is it?" Trey glanced around briefly before speaking. "The king knows everything." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "I expected that." Trey shook his head. "No, you don't understand." Pause. "He's angry." Silence. That part Caleb had also expected. But then Trey leaned closer. "And when the king is angry, people suffer." That landed differently. Caleb's grip on the gun shifted. "Who?" he asked quietly. Trey shrugged. "Anyone involved?" The words lingered. Caleb didn't respond. He simply nodded once and continued walking, but his thoughts had changed. The forest didn't feel the same that day. He moved through it, but without the usual focus, without the same clarity. His senses were there, but his mind was elsewhere. On her, on the king, on consequences. He paused near a clearing, lowering the gun slightly. "This isn't just about me anymore," he murmured. That realization settled deep. For the first time since this began, he wasn't thinking about survival. He was thinking about sacrifice. By midday, he had not taken a shot. Not because there were no opportunities, but because he wasn't present enough to take them. Finally, he stopped, lowered the gun completely, and made a decision. He turned back. The village was quieter when he returned. Not empty, but watchful. And then he saw them. 2 royal guards standing near his house, waiting. Caleb slowed his steps. His expression didn't change, but his body tensed slightly. As he approached, one of the guards stepped forward. "The king summons you." The words were formal, but the tone left no room for refusal. Caleb nodded once. "I'll come." The walk to the palace felt longer than it ever had before. Not because of distance, but because of what it meant. People watched him as he passed. Whispers followed. "He's been called. It's over for him. The king will not allow this." Caleb didn't react, but inside everything was shifting. The palace gates opened for the first time, not as a supplier, not as a passerby, but as someone summoned inside. The atmosphere was different, colder, more controlled. The guards led him through long corridors until they reached the king's chamber. "Wait!" one of them said. Caleb stood still. Moments later, "Enter!" The doors opened, and there he was, King Harlan, seated, still watching. Caleb stepped inside, stopped a few feet away, and bowed his head slightly. "Your Majesty." Silence. Heavy. Measured. The king did not respond immediately. He simply studied him long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Then, finally, "So," the king said slowly, "you are the hunter." Caleb lifted his gaze slightly. "Yes." Another pause. "And the man who thinks he can stand beside my daughter." The words were sharper now. Caleb didn't flinch. "I do not stand beside her by force," he said calmly. "I stand where she allows me." The king's eyes narrowed. "You speak boldly." "I speak truthfully." A dangerous answer. The air tightened instantly. "You are nothing," the king said coldly. Caleb didn't respond immediately, not out of fear, but out of control. "Then I was something once," he said. "And now?" Caleb met his gaze. "Now I am rebuilding." Silence. The king leaned forward slightly. "You think that matters to me?" "No." "Then why are you here?" "Because you called me." That answer hung in the air. The king studied him again. Different this time. Not just with anger, but with assessment. "You will leave this village," the king said finally. There it was. Clear. Final. Caleb's chest tightened slightly. "And if I don't?" he asked. The king's voice dropped. "Then I will make your life here impossible." Silence. The weight of authority pressed down hard. "You will not see her again," the king continued. "You will not speak to her. You will disappear from her life as if you were never in it." Each sentence struck like a hammer. Caleb stood still, not reacting but absorbing. Inside him something battled, the part that wanted to fight, to stand his ground, to refuse, and the part that understood what this could cost her. "Do you understand me?" the king asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. Then slowly, "Yes." The answer surprised even him, but it was the only one he could give. "Good," the king said. Then, with a dismissive wave, "You may go." Caleb turned, walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. Outside, the air felt different. Not because it had changed, but because he had. That evening, he didn't go to the forest. He didn't sit outside. He didn't wait. He packed a small bag, the same way he had once left the city. Because this time, he was leaving something else behind. Not wealth, not status, but love. Night fell quietly. But inside the palace, Celine knew. She felt it. The shift. The distance. And when she slipped past the guards once more and reached his house, she saw it. The bag packed, ready. "Where are you going?" she asked. Caleb turned slowly, his expression calm but heavy. "Away." The word hit her instantly. "No." "Yes, you can't." "I have to." She stepped closer. "This is because of him." Caleb didn't deny it. "It's because of us." Silence. Her eyes searched his. "You said we would face it together." He nodded. "We are." "This isn't facing it," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "This is running." "No," he said quietly. "It's protecting." The word stopped her. "Protecting who?" she asked. "You." The truth hung between them. Raw. Painful. "If I stay," Caleb continued, "this becomes a fight. And if you leave," she shot back, "it becomes a memory." Her eyes filled. "I don't want a memory." He stepped closer. "Neither do I." Silence. Then softly, "But I would rather lose you than be the reason you lose everything." That broke her. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. She shook her head slowly. You don't get to decide that for me. I'm not deciding for you, he said. I'm choosing for myself. Another silence. Heavy. Unbearable. Then she stepped forward, closer than ever before. If you walk away, she whispered, you don't just leave the village. A tear slipped down her cheek. You leave me. Caleb's chest tightened, but he didn't move. Didn't reach for her. Didn't stop her words. Because he knew she was right. And that was what made it impossible. They stood there, two people caught between love and reality. And for the first time, neither of them knew what would happen next. Because sometimes, love is not tested by distance, but by the choice to stay or walk away. The night was heavy with silence. Not peaceful, not calm, but full of things left unsaid. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his father's house, his back against the wall, his bag resting beside him. Packed. Ready. Waiting. Every second stretched. Every thought circled back to her. Celine, her voice, her tears, her words. If you walk away, you leave me. He closed his eyes briefly, tight, as if shutting them could silence the memory. But it didn't, because this wasn't like losing money or power or status. This was different. This felt like losing something he had only just found, and yet he still hadn't moved. Dawn crept in slowly, spilling pale light across the room. Caleb opened his eyes. Still there. Still the same. He exhaled. Long. Heavy. It's time, he said quietly. He reached for the bag, lifted it, and stood outside. The village was just beginning to wake, but word had already spread. He's leaving. The hunter is going. The king has driven him out. People gathered at a distance, watching, whispering. But this time, no one laughed. Even Trey stood still, arms hanging loosely at his sides. Are you really going? He asked, as Caleb stepped onto the path. Caleb nodded once. Yes. Trey hesitated, then said quietly, You proved something here. Caleb glanced at him briefly. What? That you're not what they said? A small pause. Then Caleb gave a faint nod. That was never the goal. He continued walking. Step by step away from the house, away from the forest, away from her. The road out of the village stretched ahead, long, dusty, uncertain. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because he doubted his decision, but because he understood it. Behind him, everything he had rebuilt, not in wealth, but in meaning, was being left behind. And then the sound came, low, distant, unfamiliar. An engine. Caleb slowed. Vehicles were rare on this road, especially ones that sounded like that. He turned slightly and saw them. 3 black vehicles approaching fast, raising dust behind them. The same kind of vehicles that had once been part of his everyday life. The same kind he had lost. They slowed as they reached him, then stopped. Silence followed. The doors opened. One by one, men stepped out. Well-dressed, sharp, out of place in the village, and then a familiar face. Caleb! The voice hit him instantly. Recognition, memory, shock. Daniel, he said. The man smiled. The same confident smile, but older now. Sharper. It's been a long time. Daniel Brooks, the man Caleb had once helped build from nothing. Years ago, Daniel had been struggling, an ambitious dreamer with ideas, but no direction, no structure, no capital. Caleb had seen potential, and he had invested, not just money, but time, guidance, trust. and Daniel had risen, built his own empire. Caleb stared at him for a moment, then exhaled slightly. I didn't expect to see you here. Daniel laughed softly. I've been looking for you. Looking for me? Daniel nodded. Everywhere. He stepped closer. I heard what happened. Silence. Caleb's expression hardened slightly. Then you heard wrong. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. I heard enough. Pause. Enough to know you were set up. That made Caleb look at him more closely. You believe that? Daniel gave a small smile. I know you. Simple, direct, certain. And somehow that mattered more than anything else. I traced it, Daniel continued. Accounts, transfers, shell companies. Caleb's focus sharpened instantly. And? Daniel's expression shifted. Colder now. Your partner Nathaniel. He didn't just take your money. He built a system to bury you with it. Caleb's jaw tightened. I figured. Daniel nodded. But he made one mistake. Pause. He left traces. Silence stretched. The weight of possibility began to rise. Where is he? Caleb asked. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Running! Good. Caleb said quietly. Daniel studied him for a moment, then asked, Why didn't you fight it? The question landed. Because by the time I understood it, he exhaled. It was already gone. Daniel shook his head. No, it wasn't gone. He stepped closer. You just didn't have the right help. Caleb looked at him again, and this time, there was something different in his eyes. Not defeat, not hesitation, but something awakening. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder. Thick. He handed it to Caleb. Everything is in there, he said. Evidence, accounts, legal backing. Caleb took it slowly, opened it, and began to read line by line. Proof. Clear. Detailed. Undeniable. His grip tightened slightly. This changes everything, he said. Daniel nodded. It does. Pause. But that's not all. Caleb looked up. What else? Daniel smiled. You still have assets. That surprised him. What, hidden ones? Daniel said. Accounts Nathaniel couldn't reach. Caleb frowned. I don't. You do, Daniel interrupted. You just didn't know it. Daniel gestured toward the vehicles. I've already started the process. Lawyers are involved. Your name is being cleared. Caleb stood there, still processing. From nothing to something again. Just like that. But this time it felt different, because this wasn't just about wealth. It was about truth, justice, and everything he had lost. Daniel stepped back slightly. So, he said, what do you want to do? Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the village, toward the palace, toward her. And in that moment, everything became clear. He closed the folder slowly, then looked at Daniel. I'm not leaving. Daniel smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. Back at the palace, Celine stood at her window, watching the road, waiting, hoping, fearing. And then she saw them. The vehicles, the movement, the gathering. Her heart quickened. What is happening? She whispered. Because something had shifted again. And this time, it wasn't loss. It was return. Back on the road, Caleb stood taller. Not because of the money, not because of the power, but because for the first time since everything had fallen apart, he had something again. Not just to rebuild, but to fight for. And this time, he wasn't just a man trying to survive. He was a man ready to risk. And the village was about to witness it. The village had not seen anything like it before. Not in years, not ever. 3 black vehicles stood at the entrance of the dusty road. Their engines quiet now, but their presence loud enough to draw attention from every corner of the village. People gathered in clusters, whispering, pointing, watching. Who are they? Why are they here? Did something happen? Children ran barefoot, circling the vehicles with wide eyes. Women paused their chores. Men stood with arms folded, trying to make sense of it all. And at the center of it, Caleb. But he didn't look like the same man who had walked into the village weeks ago. Not because of his clothes, not because of wealth, but because of his presence. There was something different in the way he stood. Straighter, calmer, certain. The same quiet strength, but now sharpened. Trey pushed through the small crowd, his curiosity overwhelming him. "Caleb, what is all this?" he asked. Caleb glanced at him briefly. "Something I left unfinished," he said. That answer only deepened the confusion. Behind him, Daniel stepped forward, speaking to one of the men in a low voice, already giving instructions. Phones were out. Calls were being made. Things were moving fast. The village could feel it. Something big was happening. Inside the palace, the shift was felt just as strongly. A guard hurried through the corridor, his footsteps echoing sharply. "Your Majesty." King Harlan looked up from where he sat. "What is it?" "There are vehicles in the village, foreign ones." The king frowned slightly. "Foreign?" "Yes, Your Majesty. And they are with the hunter." Silence. The words hung in the air. The hunter. Caleb. The king stood slowly. "Prepare the courtyard," he said. Moments later, the palace gates opened, and the convoy moved. Dust rose again as the vehicles rolled forward. This time toward the very place that had once looked down on the man walking beside them. Caleb walked calmly, not rushing, not showing off, just walking the same way he had always walked. The gates parted, and for the first time Caleb entered the palace, not as a supplier, not as a summoned man, but as someone expected. The courtyard was lined with guards. Servants stood at a distance, and at the far end, King Harlan waited. Caleb stopped a few steps away. Daniel stood behind him along with two other men. Silence settled across the courtyard. Heavy, measured. The king studied him long. Then, finally, "You return quickly for a man who was leaving," he said. Caleb held his gaze. "I changed my mind." A bold answer. The king's eyes narrowed slightly. "So, I see." His gaze shifted briefly to the men behind Caleb. "And who are they?" Before Caleb could speak, Daniel stepped forward. "Daniel Brooks," he said with a slight bow. "A business associate." The king raised an eyebrow. "Business," he repeated. "Yes, Your Majesty." There was confidence in Daniel's tone, not arrogance, but certainty. The king looked back at Caleb. "I thought you were a hunter." Caleb didn't flinch. "I am." Pause. "But I was more before that." Silence. The king stepped down from where he stood, moving closer. "And now?" he asked. Caleb met his gaze. "Now I remember." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Daniel stepped forward again, holding out the same folder. "Your Majesty," he said, "there are matters you should be aware of." The king didn't take it immediately. "What matters?" Daniel's voice remained calm. "The man you call a hunter was once one of the most powerful businessmen across continents." Murmurs stirred among the guards. The king said nothing. "He was betrayed," Daniel continued, "framed, stripped of everything." The king's eyes flickered slightly. "And now?" he asked. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. "Now the truth is returning." The king took the folder, opened it and began to read. The courtyard fell into complete silence. Page after page, evidence, details, proof. The king's expression changed slowly, not dramatically, but noticeably. from skepticism to focus, from focus to understanding. Finally, he closed the folder and looked up, not at Daniel, at Caleb. "You were wronged," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. Caleb nodded once. Yes. Another silence. Then the king spoke again. "And yet you came here." "Yes." "With nothing." "Yes." "And you chose to stay." Caleb held his gaze. "Yes." The king studied him more deeply now. "And instead of begging—" Pause. "You worked." Another pause. "You endured mockery." Silence. "You built something from nothing." The words were not praise, but they were acknowledgement. Caleb didn't respond. He didn't need to, because the truth was already there. The king turned slightly, walking a few steps away, thinking, processing. Then he stopped and spoke without turning. "Do you love my daughter?" The question cut through everything, sharp, direct. Caleb didn't hesitate. "Yes." The king turned back slowly. "And why?" Caleb's expression didn't change, but his voice carried something deeper now. "Because she saw me when I had nothing." Silence. "And what does that mean to you?" Caleb stepped forward slightly. "It means she saw the truth." Pause. "And chose it." The courtyard seemed to hold its breath. The king's eyes searched his. Long. "Then will you protect her?" he asked. Caleb's answer came without pause. "With my life!" Silence. The kind that decides things. The king exhaled slowly, and for the first time his posture shifted. Not as a ruler, but as a father. "You lost everything," he said quietly. "And yet you did not lose yourself." Caleb said nothing because there was nothing to add. The king nodded slowly, as if coming to a conclusion. Then finally, "You have my blessing." The words landed like thunder, but softly. Gasps broke through the courtyard. Whispers followed instantly. Caleb stood still, processing not the victory, but the meaning. The king stepped closer. "But understand this," he said. "My daughter is not a reward." Caleb met his gaze. "I know. She is a responsibility. I know. And if you fail her—" Caleb didn't let him finish. "I won't." The king held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "Bring her," he said to the guards. Moments later, Celine appeared. She stopped when she saw him. Caleb standing there, not leaving, not gone. Her eyes widened slightly. "You stayed," she whispered. Caleb gave a faint smile. "I said we would face it." She stepped forward slowly, then faster, until she stood right in front of him. "You didn't leave me," she said softly. "No," he replied. And this time there was no doubt, no fear, no hesitation, because everything that stood between them had just been removed. The king watched them, not with anger, but with understanding, because now he saw what she had seen. Not a fallen man, but a man who rose. And that was worth more than any crown. And in that moment, the hunter was no longer just a survivor. He was a man reborn. The village had never looked like this before. Not during harvest, not during festivals, not even during royal celebrations of the past. This was different. Color filled every corner. Bright fabrics hung across pathways, tied between trees and rooftops, swaying gently in the warm breeze. Fresh flowers lined the roads, their scent carried softly through the air. Drums echoed from dawn, their rhythm alert, steady, joyful, impossible to ignore. People came from neighboring villages, from distant towns, even from the city. Everyone had heard the story. The fallen billionaire, the hunter, the princess, and now the wedding. Children ran barefoot through the decorated paths, laughing as they chased each other. Women gathered in groups, adjusting their head wraps and admiring one another's attire. Men stood in clusters discussing the transformation they had witnessed, with a mix of disbelief and admiration. Who would have thought? He came with nothing, and now he marries the princess. Trey stood among them, quieter than usual. I laughed at him, he said suddenly. The others looked at him. And now? One asked. Trey exhaled. Now I understand him. At the far end of this village, the palace stood in full glory, decorated beyond anything it had seen before. Royal banners hung proudly. The gates were wide open, not just for royalty, but for everyone. Inside, preparations were just as intense. Servants moved swiftly, carrying trays, adjusting fabrics, ensuring every detail was perfect. Musicians tuned their instruments. Elders gathered in quiet discussion. And at the center of it all, Princess Celine. She stood before a large mirror dressed in her wedding attire. It was breathtaking, a blend of tradition and elegance. Rich fabric flowing gracefully, intricate patterns woven into every layer, gold accents catching the light with every subtle movement. But it wasn't the dress that made her radiant. It was her expression, calm, certain, happy. Her maid adjusted the final piece gently. You look like a queen already, she said softly. Celine smiled faintly. I feel like myself. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Caleb stood still, dressed in traditional attire that reflected both dignity and strength. He looked different. Not like the man who had walked into the village weeks ago. Not like the man who had carried deer through dusty roads. But also not like the billionaire he once was. This version of him was something else, balanced, grounded. Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed, watching him with a satisfied expression. Not bad, Daniel said. Caleb glanced at him. You've seen me in better. Daniel shook his head. No, he said. Pause. I haven't. Caleb didn't respond immediately, but something in his eyes softened. You came a long way, Daniel added. Caleb exhaled slightly. I had to. Daniel stepped closer. And now? Caleb looked ahead toward the courtyard, toward where everything was about to begin. Now, he said quietly, I choose what comes next. The drums grew louder. The signal had been given. Guests gathered in the grand courtyard. Rows formed. Voices hushed. Anticipation filled the air. Then the ceremony began. Caleb stood at the front beside King Harlan, the same king who had once ordered him to leave, now standing beside him, not as an opponent, but as family. The king glanced at him briefly. You stand differently today, he said. Caleb gave a small nod. I feel differently. The king studied him for a moment, then said quietly, Good. And then she appeared. Princess Celine, walking slowly toward him. The entire courtyard seemed to pause, not because they were told to, but because they had to. She moved with grace, with confidence, with purpose, but her eyes were only on him. Caleb watched her approach, and for the first time the man who had faced loss, humiliation, and survival without breaking felt something close to awe. She stopped in front of him and smiled. You didn't leave, she said softly. He shook his head. I told you I wouldn't. A small laugh escaped her, and I believed you. The ceremony continued. Words were spoken, traditions honored, blessings given. But for them, it wasn't about the ritual. It was about the journey, from nothing to everything, from strangers to something undeniable. When the moment came, they faced each other fully, hands joined, eyes locked. Do you choose each other? The elder asked. Not just in ease, but in hardship. Caleb spoke first. "I choose her," he said. No hesitation. No doubt. Celine followed. "I choose him." And that was it. Not just a promise, but a decision. The final words were spoken. The union sealed. And as the drums exploded into celebration, the village erupted. Cheers, laughter, music. Caleb pulled her gently closer and whispered, "You saw me when I had nothing." Celine smiled. "I saw you when you were everything." The celebration lasted for hours. Dancing, food, stories. The same people who had once mocked him now spoke of him with admiration. The same village that had watched him fall now celebrated his rise. Later that evening, as the sun began to set once more, Caleb and Celine stood at the edge of the village, the same place he had once walked alone, now together. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "About what? The life you lost?" Caleb looked out at the horizon, then shook his head slowly. "No," she tilted her head. "Why not?" He turned to her, because this time his answer was different. "Because I didn't lose it," he said. "I outgrew it." Celine smiled. And as they stood there watching the sky shift into evening, one truth settled quietly between them. This wasn't just a story of love. It was a story of becoming, of losing everything and finding something greater. Not wealth, not power, but purpose. And hand in hand, they walked forward, not into a perfect life, but into a real one, together. And this time, nothing could take that away.